Why, hello everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Riverdale. So, in the last video, I didn't realize the time had expired, and I kept talking, so I was just kind of talking to myself for a little bit, so I'm going to go back and finish explaining this diagram before we move on. Hopefully this time it'll be recorded. So, as I was saying when I got cut off, the government collects this rectangle of revenue, so there's government surplus here, which is this rectangle right here. And so when we're looking at the total change in surplus in the whole economy, when we look at consumer surplus, this portion of consumer surplus in orange was actually just transferred to the government. That's the top portion of the government's surplus. This portion of producer surplus that was lost was actually not totally lost. It was just transferred to the government. That's the bottom part of the government surplus rectangle. However, these two triangles on the end of producer and consumer surplus, those were not transferred anywhere. So we still have a deadweight loss from this tax. Okay. So that was a tax on consumers. Let's see what happens when we put a $10 tax on producers. Okay. So this time, since we are putting the tax on producers, it will be like shifting their cost curve up by $10. So now the supply curve will look like this. The distance between the two lines vertically is $10 everywhere. So this was the original. That was the original market price. So again, we're going to have two different prices here. There is the price that the firm is actually going to charge consumers. That's right here. It looks like, let's call it $39. And then there's the price that the producer actually receives, which is only $29 because the government is taking $10. So again, we have this gap in between what people are actually paying and what they're actually getting. In this case, there's a gap in between what the firm is charging and what it's actually receiving. So let's start looking through the different surpluses. The original consumer surplus was this blue triangle. The new consumer surplus is, that scared the bejesus out of me. Thanks, Java. New consumer surplus is this smaller triangle, so consumers lost this trapezoid. So that's the change in consumer surplus. Producers. So on the producer side, I see these commercials for surfaces all the time, and there are these teachers making amazing drawings of like sharks and stuff and spinning the picture around, and I can barely work these markers. Anyway, sidetrack. Okay, so the original producer surplus was the triangle below the price line but above the supply curve, so it was this guy. And then under this tax, producers are only actually getting $29. So that is the new producer surplus. So they have lost this trapezoid's worth of surplus. But as we saw before, the government exists in this scenario, and they are collecting $10 per good per unit, and we are at the same quantity exchange. It looks like about 22 units. So the government surplus is this rectangle here. Part of it is contributed by producers. Part of it is contributed by consumers. So we get that the change in consumer surplus was minus the pink trapezoid. The change in producer surplus was minus the green trapezoid. the government, under this tax, actually collected the area of the orange rectangle. A portion of that came from consumers. So this portion was from consumers. And then this portion was contributed to the government by producers. However, just as we saw before, these two pieces, these two triangles, were not transferred anywhere. They were just lost. So again, we have this amount of deadweight loss. So that amount of surplus was just lost. Notice that the amounts of money, the size of deadweight loss, the change in surplus are identical for both, whether we put the tax on consumers or producers. And actually, when we look at, so it makes no difference whether the government taxes producers or consumers. The change in the economy is going to be exactly identical. And that's because when you place a tax on somebody in the economy, they don't actually bear the entire cost of that. So if you look, I'm going to erase a bunch of the stuff on here so that we can see it more clearly. Okay, so if we take this case where we were taxing producers, for example, so this was the new supply line. Okay, so this right here is the $10 amount of the tax. Notice that a portion of that, so neither the consumer nor the producer is bearing the full $10 tax. If we look at the original market price here at Star, the price went up for consumers by this amount, right? Increase in price for consumers. And then the amount, the per unit income that the producers were making went down from Star to this point. So here, this is decreased revenue, decreased per unit revenue for producers. But notice that the amount that impacts the consumers and producers, neither one of them is a full $10. So this entire distance is 10. Consumers are bearing some of that cost, and then producers are bearing some of that cost. So consumers and producers actually share the tax burden. How much? So I'm not saying that they share it equally. One side may have to bear more of a burden than the other, and we're going to look at some examples of that later. But generally, when you place a per unit tax on the economy, both the consumers and the producers are going to be worse off, but they're going to share that burden between them. You can't just tax producers and expect that that's only going to affect producers. It's going to spill over and affect consumers. Same thing if you try to tax consumers, and when you tax consumers, that will spill over and affect producers. It won't just affect consumers. And how they share the burden of the tax is related to the elasticity of demand and the elasticity of supply, but we're going to get to that later. Okay, moving on. We're going to do subsidies next. I'm on the edge of my seat. Hopefully I'll notice when this video ends, so I'm not just talking to myself. Okay, so these are some exercises for you to try. Number one, use a graph from the previous example and calculate the change in consumer surplus, producer surplus, and government surplus if the government provides a $10 per unit subsidy. So subsidies work like taxes, but in reverse. If this was our original demand curve and this was our original supply curve, if we put so when we talk about taxing consumers, let's say, we saw that would shift the demand curve down by 10 units. If we're going to give a subsidy of $10 to the consumer, that would shift the demand curve outwards by 10 units. So this will be $10. Similarly, if you give a subsidy to a producer, that shifts the marginal cost curve down, or shifts the supply curve out, however you want to think about it, by $10. So using that, go ahead and work through the different changes in surpluses. Just keep in mind that now the government surplus is going to be negative because it's paying out money. That's what a subsidy is. So work through that, and we'll go through this solution in class, or I'll post it on PowerSchool. Number 2, draw the graph of a market where demand is much more inelastic for supply. It should say than supply. Draw a graph of a market where demand is much more inelastic than supply, and then apply a $15 tax. So for number 2, you want to start out with a situation where demand looks something like this, and supply looks something like this, and apply a $15 tax. It doesn't matter, as we've just shown, which one you which side you apply the tax to, so you can go ahead and put it on producers if you want. The distance between these two lines is $15, and work through the changes in consumer surplus, and try to figure out who's change in surplus, whether it's consumers or producers, who's going to lose more surplus, the inelastic party, and this side consumers, or the elastic side, which is producers. And then number 3 is a similar question. You need to draw 2 markets, one with elastic demand and one with inelastic demand. So this might be market 1. And then they're supposed to have the same supply curve. So here's inelastic demand. And then give it the same supply curve in both. Impose a $3 tax on both of them, and compute the deadweight loss for each market. So deadweight loss is, we've gone over it several times in the previous examples. If the government is considering taxing one of these 2 markets, which one should they tax if they want to minimize deadweight loss? So this is actually a big topic in public finance, which is the study of government policy and the economy. So the government can obviously place taxes on a lot of different things. And the question is, what should the government tax so that it has the smallest possible deadweight loss? Because remember, deadweight loss is just surplus that disappears. So if the government can choose between different items to actually tax or to tax more heavily, they want to try to choose the policy that minimizes deadweight loss. So think about these 3 questions. We will go over them in class when we have lecture next. But these are some key concepts about change in surplus and government interventions. Thanks for listening, and I'll see y'all soon.